So, I'll start with this. I spent the day in first talking to a bunch of, the entire middle school. And my first experience was I got up on stage and I looked into the eyes of fifth graders and I felt incredibly scared. I was totally in shock. I was like, oh my God, I had this all planned out, and I worry it's going to be over people's heads. And so I changed my talk a bit, and I'm going on public record saying that I made a huge mistake. That in the course of being here for the entire day, I realized that I was selling Bank Street kids short. I had been out way too long outside of the classrooms here. And I made my penance by going to the 8th grade class. And I met with them for 30 minutes. And I think the teachers were a little nervous that the kids wouldn't be able to, or they wouldn't be interested in talking with me. Because I think they were prepping me to say, well, maybe we should talk about high school process instead. And, or not instead, but maybe that's something that we should talk about. And what ended up following is a series of peppering of questions that were more insightful, deeper understanding of politics, and just frankly, fun and exciting questions, better than any adult has asked me in the course of my book tour. And it came from a bunch of 13 and 14-year-olds. And it was incredible. I was getting questions about whether or not we should lower the voting age. And then another kid countered, shouldn't we raise the voting age since your frontal lobe isn't fully developed until the age of 25? I was asked whether or not Puerto Rico should have representation in Congress. And then when I said yes, and someone immediately countered, then doesn't that mean DC as well? And I said yes. I was asked about why doesn't the media cover conflicts like that in Somalia? And I had to go into a little bit of a conversation about consolidation of media and advertising revenue. And when I finished, I was like, oh my God, was that too wonky? And she said, no, that makes total sense. And I kind of sat back and said, oh my God, I don't know what just happened in those 30 minutes, but it was one of the best experiences on this entire book tour. And it happened with a bunch of 13 and 14-year-olds. And I thought to myself, was I like that? I have no idea, but I hope so. Because if I was as smart as those kids, then I was doing pretty well. So that was really remarkable. But then the second story, and then I'll kind of go into the book a bit, is immediately after that, I sat in on the 7th grade classroom today. And it was at the invite of one of the teachers who is also a Vassar alum. And it was a history class where they were teaching about the slave trade, about Middle Passage from Central Africa to the coast to be shipped off into the quote-unquote New World. And she started the class with a discussion of why is it important to study difficult history? Basically, why is it so important to study the trauma of the past? She had everyone write down some notes in a notebook and get ready for the discussion. And what followed was a lively discussion that frankly could have come out of my Vassar classroom. In fact, that's probably a question that was asked in my Vassar classroom because my advisor was one of the leading researchers on memory politics about dealing with past trauma. And I thought she would have been very proud that that was a conversation that was going on among 12 and 13-year-olds. And they weren't just saying, oh, well, it's important to understand history. No, they understood that we have to learn about the past. We have to learn about the difficult stuff to make sure that we don't repeat it. And one of the most remarkable things that was said about the entire thing was someone was talking about, the development of racism. And they wanted to know kind of where did racism come from? And so the teacher responded, well, racism was kind of, a lot of research shows that racism was developed to justify the economic system, to justify keeping other humans as cargo. And she immediately countered with, that makes me really sad, but at the same time, it makes me really hopeful. Because if racism isn't inevitable, then that means one day we can beat it. And that's coming from a 12-year-old. This understanding that nothing is inevitable, that we can make the world a better place. And so I found my hope today. I found my daily hope just in talking with the students at Bank Street. I can't say that I thought that's how my day would go. I was kind of so profoundly moved by these young adults, frankly, not children, young adults, because they're certainly more mature than I think a lot of adults are, that I decided to scrap my speech when I was talking to the entire faculty this afternoon a couple hours ago. because I just felt that what I was going to say didn't capture the experience that I just had. And so I want to start my talk on that, because I think that, as I'll say, I think that Bank Street and like-minded schools do prepare kids to think critically. And I think critical thinking is our best hope for making a better world. And I can go into that more in depth. But I'll talk a little bit about the book, because I think that, obviously that's why I was invited, but I think there's a lot of questions and a lot of, fear around Donald Trump. And rightfully so. When we decided to write the book, there were essentially two questions that we wanted to answer. The first was Donald Trump, did he really come out of nowhere? Was it really an anomaly? Or was it part of a longer trend in our society that led to him? And had he not won, might there have been a future Trump? God forbid, someone even worse. That was question one. And question two is, why are we as a society together creating a world that none of us really seem to want? If you go around the country and ask the questions, are you happy with how things are? Are you happy that corporations have so much power? Are you happy that there's so much money in politics? I can tell you straight up that the answer is no. No one is happy with the way things are going. And the polls bear that out. No one thinks America is on a good trajectory. People are very concerned. And as my mother so rudely took my story, I went to go visit my brother. And my brother voted for Donald Trump. But he was railing against money in politics. And he was telling me how he voted for Trump in a way to try and break that cycle. And that's one of the first things we realized in writing the book, that people who voted for Donald Trump had a lot of the same concerns that people who voted for Bernie Sanders did. And it's really difficult to understand that, because there's real racism and xenophobia in many people who voted for Donald Trump's minds. And we can't ignore that. But at the same time, there is this moment of potential connection between this feeling of powerlessness and desire to express anger towards a system that frankly doesn't represent most people.
Just a quick question. Did you decide to write this book after the election or during the
well,
how did that actually?
We wrote a 30-page book proposal and submitted it before the election, and then once the election happened, we trashed it. About similar topics, but different enough that we said, frankly, this just doesn't work. That these two pressing questions really need to be answered.
Yeah. And the second question existed before the outcome of the election.
That's precisely right. And I would go so far as to say that had Hillary Clinton won, that second question would very much be present. And the latent anger and powerlessness, which I'll kind of go into why it's there, would be very dangerous, and would still have opened us up very much so to Trump in 2020, or an even worse version. So in answering those two questions, the answer really comes down to democracy. And so the answer to the first question about Trump is, was Trump inevitable? I don't know about inevitable, but he was the product of a very long and systematic, concerted assault on our democratic institutions. I am very, very confident in that analysis. Very confident. And it all starts with and this kind of gets to the second question of why are we creating a society that we don't want? The answer to that has to do with democracy. It has to do with the fundamental belief, or disbelief, that humans have the ability to self-govern. And so the answer to both of these things really comes down to democracy and the assault on our democratic institutions. Because the more and more I did this, the research for this book, there are amazing works that have been published in the last 5 years. Really in the past 5 years, and 5 years alone, is when all this information really started to come out. About just how concerted the assault on our democratic institutions has been over the last couple decades. But it's actually most interesting because the key to it all likely was revealed by an investigative journalist in the late 80s. And it was a memorandum that was written by Lewis Powell, who would soon become a Supreme Court justice 2 months later. And it was commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce to basically, they asked Lewis Powell, who was on the board of directors of a bunch of different corporations, said, well, how do we make sure to get the business point of view into politics? And he writes this memo that outlines the entire playbook for the right-wing assault on our democratic institutions and economic agenda for the 40 years that followed it. And what he outlined was a broad-based assault. He said that businesses need to make their voice heard in every aspect of our society, starting from monitoring textbooks for elementary school kids and grade school kids, making sure that their business view is heard, all the way to colleges, funding chairs and programs and institutes in universities to make sure that they push things like law and economics, which was once a fringe issue, a fringe view of how law can be explained by rational self-interest. And it was basically hyper-libertarianism and became legitimate once the institutes like Harvard had a law and economics program that was basically funded by one wealthy family. In fact, one wealthy family funded, I think, over 60%, or maybe it's even 80%, I'd have to fact check in the book, of all law and economics programs in the early 5 years of kind of the 80s, late 70s and 80s, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to double check with myself in the book. And it really became, in terms of shaping the education system and what is taught, really funded by some corporations and very, very wealthy families. So Powell was writing for corporations, but ultimately a bunch of really cabal. It was a handful of very wealthy families jumped on as well. The connection between the Powell Memorandum and the wealthy families is not overly clear, but the wealthy families followed the playbook verbatim. And the playbook went further than just making sure we teach our kids a certain way. It went to funding think tanks. The Cato Institute was created in the 70s, and it was primarily funded just by Charles Koch, who is now one of the two infamous Koch brothers. The Heritage Foundation was kind of revitalized, or really kind of came into being in the late 70s by really just a handful of the same billionaire money. And those two organizations, with the American Enterprise Institute, which was a kind of a long existing but came into being more partisan, began to shape the way policy studies were done. That they used all their wealth to push policy in a way that was hyper-partisan and expressed this anti-democratic and pro-extreme market agenda. And just how much it changed. In a study in the 90s, I believe, sometime between the 80s and 90s, a survey of the think tanks that were cited in the media, just how effective this funding of think tanks was to kind of shape the American mindset around these issues. Conservative think tanks were cited over 50% of the time in the media, whereas progressive think tanks were cited 14%. So there becomes this extreme imbalance in the way that think tanks shape views, because there's much more funding of these certain ideological think tanks. And it extends beyond that too, the way the media has shifted. I mean, this is the question that one of the kids asked me today about, well, why doesn't the media cover things? Well, a lot of it comes to do with, the Reagan's FCC. They got rid of the fairness doctrine. He appoints pro-free market, anti-public good FCC commissioners, and they gut the fairness doctrine, which once upon a time ensured a range of views being aired on public broadcasting. They got rid of that, and then it wasn't just Republicans either, but they shaped the narrative in such a way, they shaped the political sphere enough that in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which got rid of certain standards to prevent media consolidation. So raised the number of the share of market that certain media outlets could reach, and one of the chief lobbyists for that was the Heritage Foundation. Right? It's all circular. Heritage Foundation and other Koch Institute kind of funded the push to make sure that legislation passed and had these riders to get rid of media like anti-consolidation requirements. And it goes on and on. We talk in the book about really shaping the American mindset, which again I'll talk about why education is, in fact, as we were potentially talking about, is might be the key to really resisting parts of this ideological push. But it extends beyond that. We kind of shape, we go into more about how these kind of fringe billionaires and corporations try to shape the American mindset. And it goes, one of the key developments and what really led to Donald Trump is the concerted effort to delegitimize government itself. When Newt Gingrich called for a civil war, kind of the partisan approach that had the scale, duration, and savagery of civil war, that's how we should view politics, as civil war, right? That's not really how democratic deliberation is supposed to be done. And then you saw it really under Obama, taken on steroids, where the Republican Party filibusters at an unprecedented rate, causes the government to shut down, costing our country $24 billion, lowering trust in government to all-time lows. And then, of course, there's the Supreme Court nomination, where Justice Merrick, or the Judge Merrick Garland, the longest anybody had ever waited for a up or down vote or hearing for a Supreme Court nominee was 125 days. Garland, Obama's appointee to replace Scalia, who died, never got a hearing. It was almost a full year. And obviously the Republicans were able to nominate their own justice as soon as they took back both houses and the presidency. And now we have Justice Neil Gorsuch. And so faith in the ability of party politics to solve or to at least deliberate properly has declined even further. So I won't go too much more into the manipulating the mindset part, because I really want to get to the hopeful stuff, because I think that's what people want. They don't, you know, that our book was to outline the problem, because we need to know, as the teacher, you know, the 7th grade teacher was saying today, we need to know the tough history so we make sure we know how to fight back. But I don't want to talk too much. But the second part, I think it's really important, is a lot of these policies that were being pushed by the Heritage Foundation and Cato just aren't popular. I mean, you see it now in the healthcare debate. A lot of these extremely hyper libertarian, really libertarian on steroids approaches to politics aren't popular. So what's the solution? Well, just make sure people can't participate. So the floodgates to money in politics are unleashed, and that way you can you fund who you want to fund. That money can have more influence in politics. You suppress the vote. 33 states now have voter ID laws, which are shown to discriminate against people of color, especially African Americans, students, lower socioeconomic levels, the elderly. The number of people who, one study shows the number of people who were actively couldn't vote, like basically who were going to vote but didn't vote in Wisconsin, the state that Donald Trump won by, was about 40 some odd thousand. He won by 23, I think. So it was almost double the margin of his victory, of people who couldn't vote. And it goes further. Gerrymandering. Most people talk about gerrymandering, but most people didn't realize that in 2010, Republicans were able to take back a lot of the state house with newly unleashed corporate money and some billionaire money after the Citizens United decision to infiltrate the states, take over state legislatures, and then offer pro bono assistance in rigging the maps. And gerrymandering is an interesting subject. I mean, we can talk about this more certainly, but gerrymandering, which is basically drawing lines to pick your voters, has been done for 200 years. But what's different now is the money and then the map-making technology. When I was here at Bank Street, we were still using floppy disks, and that was only in like 2005, right? Like, so think about how much technology has increased since floppy disks, and you have to believe that the technology to draw a map and to isolate metadata and all the other amazing things you can do with technology has also increased. And now figure out how you can do that to manipulate a map. And that's why this past cycle was so bad, why people are so up in arms about gerrymandering. So I can go on, the increase in lobbying and a million other kind of, getting rid of polling locations, ways of suppressing the vote to make sure that these unpopular policies can pass. Because on one hand, you shape the mindset, and for those who don't agree with you, you suppress the votes. Because the people who are disenfranchised are those who are most going to be affected by these policies. So it's in tandem. You can't have one of these strategies without the other. But that's not, so that's the history. That's why we're here today, and I think that's why Donald Trump is president. Both because there was voter suppression, but also just because the system itself has been denigrated to such a degree that the only solution for many Americans who are brutalized by an economic system that doesn't care about them, right? I mean, the policies that these institutes are putting forth, I mean, just brutalizes a lot of people, like my brother. When I went to go see him, it was bleak, He's doing a fine job, but it's really bleak. And he's a, white man, and it's very bleak.
So, but do you also think, there's a backlash, you get this black president,
Yes.
8 years, and society, like white men, whoever,
Yeah.
a group of, more women voted for him too.
Yeah.
like you wonder if there's this backlash, like, we did black, so now we can't ever do that again.
Yeah,
I was trying not to rhyme, but, you have to think about it, because then I asked the question for you, in your research, did you think about, like, what was it that mobilized so many people, young people, to vote for Obama? Like, there was grassroots efforts made there, and like, what did we learn from that if we're thinking about our history and this hope, that all of a sudden, 8 years later, it disappeared?
Yeah, no, I think
was
that...
suppressed, or, all your research that shows all the other pieces that came into play?
No, I think that the black flash was real. And it was also, I think, very much perpetuated and caused by places like Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute and other, the Tea Party movement was funded by the Koch brothers. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's not forget that. It wasn't an organic movement. It was what's called an AstroTurf campaign. Mm-hmm. Freedom Works, which is a formerly Koch brother network, was the main mobilizer. And that was, they had millions of dollars. They were paying off Glenn Beck to talk about the Tea Party movement. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question. I mean, there's no question that it was made so much easier to denigrate the institution when there's a black man in office. There's no question whatsoever in my mind, nor should it be in anyone's mind. Race can't be taken out of this equation. And so my suggesting that that Trump is a byproduct of a denigrated institution does not suggest that I don't think that race played a role. In fact, I think that the denigration of the institution wouldn't have been possible without having a black man in office, because it made a lot more people much more willing to say, well, democracy doesn't work. And also, the crazy part is that if you read some of the works that are done in the investigative journalism, like Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which is kind of I would say, most indebted to this book, she describes the moment when Obama was elected, that the kind of extreme right wing, this cabal of billionaires, didn't just sit back on Inauguration Day where they were plotting. They were plotting how to take it back at one of their summits that are really secretive in this kind of big enclave. And they then started they'd already started, but really kind of continued to build this summit where they would bring in the wealthiest of wealthiest donors, where it's like $100,000 to just buy in, and then mobilize the resources to strategize about how to take the country back. And I think that a lot of that strategy relied on pressuring, putting poking this notion of oh, it's a black man in office. Let's just poke this race issue. Let's pressure this race issue. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. So that's the bad stuff. But the bad stuff doesn't preclude good things. And I think that that's the kind of key of the book. I always feel like we spend too much time whenever we're on book tour talking about the bad stuff as opposed to the good stuff. Because it's so complicated. It really is so multifaceted that it requires a lot of explanation. But the good news is, I'll kind of go through it a little bit quickly, because I really do want to open this up. But the good news is pretty simple, I think. Simple, maybe not inevitable, but I think that to understand why I'm hopeful is pretty simple. One, public consensus is on the side that people are really pissed off. 85% of Americans want fundamental change in the way we fund our elections. 60% believe we should do everything we can do to make sure that every American can vote. 75% of Americans feel that they themselves have too little influence in Washington, D.C. That cuts across all partisan divide. The voting stuff is a little trickier because groups like the Heritage Foundation have really pushed this myth of voter fraud, which there is none. And the studies they put out are just such atrocious intellectual malfeasance that I can't even begin to explain it. I put so much work into trying to do the research to combat if someone says voter fraud is real, but no one has ever challenged me on this. So if anyone wants to challenge me on this, I say go for it. So people are really pissed off, and that the Bernie and Trump voters and Hillary voters as well. Most people don't realize that Hillary's democracy platform I couldn't have written it better. The problem was she didn't campaign on it. I fundamentally think had she campaigned on what was already in her platform around democracy and about the system is rigged, I think she would have won. Because I think she would have spoken to people like my brother. Public consensus on our side, so we're not starting from scratch. We don't have to actually we don't have to tell people there's a problem. People know there's a problem. But we're also not starting from scratch because there are other countries in the world that have democracies that have dealt with these issues. I spent time abroad we know it works. We have, you know, at least from other countries. And there are also pro-democracy think tanks that have done the work to really think about what kind of solutions, you know, could we possibly enact in the United States. So that's kind of step one, is that like we're really not starting from scratch in terms of like what are the ways that we can fix this problem that has been wrought over the last 40 years. The second thing is that, believe it or not, there are a lot of state-based reforms that have passed really simultaneously with this assault on democracy. They may have won most of the states, you know, they might have denigrated the governments in most of the states and the federal government, but there are pockets of serious reform. New York City is one of my favorite examples. And that's the one I've been citing since Dan Fu and I were organizing back in college. Because New York City in 1988, after a corruption scandal, enacts public financing of elections, where small money gets matched at a 6-to-1 rate. Because you can't limit money, based on the Supreme Court says you basically can't limit the amount that someone can give independently, or at least from time to time you can't have a really strict standard on how much you can give directly either. But what you can do is you can raise the money, you can augment the voices of ordinary people who can't give the maximum amount. Because really only, I think it's $6.4 billion was spent in this election, and 0.5% funded about 2/3 of it. So like raising the ability of small donors is a great example of reform. And New York's had it since '88, and the New York City Council is primarily people of color. It reflects the communities in which the politicians reflect the communities in which they represent, and that's like very, very great. That's really good news. And there are many other kind of these examples of reform that I could quote, and that's important for a couple reasons, I think. One, it shows that it gives us more data. Every time we kind of implement a new reform, we just get more information about it. It shows that, and then that thing can spur more change. I mean, one of my favorite examples is Oregon passed something called automatic voter registration in 2015. And AVR basically just, if you go to the DMV, you'll probably have to fill out the same form, the same information like 1 million times. It's like name, address, social security number, and a couple of other things. So instead of filling out that like 1 million times, you just fill it out once, and then if you want to opt out, you can opt out. And then if you don't, they just send it to the Board of Elections and they register you to vote themselves. And for the first 3 months that Oregon had that, the registrations tripled. And like that gives us data. That gives us more. And then 9 states in Washington, D.C. have followed suit from that, which is great. It creates momentum, which is kind of the second thing. These state-based reforms create new momentum, and that's really exciting. I was talking so California just passed the Disclose Act, which is like one of the most kind of radical pieces of disclosure legislation of money in politics. And I was talking to the guy who was leading it, and he said that most of the people who were fighting for it, and when they talked to voters, what they were most excited about wasn't necessarily about what they were doing in California, but they truly believed that if they took the first step, if they displayed the courage to pass the reform, this new kind of novel reform, that they could inspire the nation. And you see that across states. Each state, when they pass these new laws, they say, well, maybe we can inspire someone else to do it. Maybe we can inspire, the people in Washington State to do the same thing, like our neighbors. And so there's the kind of the cross-state kind of competition almost. And that's really exciting because that then creates more momentum. But then probably the most exciting for me, and I won't belabor the point about state-based reform, but most of these, well, not most, but a lot of them get passed by ballot initiative. Because remember I was saying that most people are pissed off. So the novel thing is that when most people are pissed off and you put it on the ballot, it wins. So my favorite story, and the one that I kind of love highlighting, is in 2016, there were 17 ballot initiatives that had pro-democracy reform in them, and 14 of them passed. So the same year that Donald Trump was elected president, 14 out of 17 ballot initiatives across the country passed about democracy reform. And my favorite is South Dakota. Voted Republican in 80% of all of its statewide elections in its history. So since 1824, I think, 80% Republicans win statewide elections. And it passes probably the most radical piece of anti-corruption legislation that deals with money politics, created this new voucher system to give people money, basically give people money to give to candidates, to donate to their campaigns. And it passed in South Dakota. Because people resonated with that anti-corruption frame. The state legislature ended up repealing what the citizens passed, but now they're out mobilizing again to try and get it on the Constitution in 2018. So the momentum is there, and they're really pushing it. I always seem to spend the most time, or the least amount of time on this last point, which is the most important part of the book, which is that all of this means, what all of this kind of has led to is a democracy movement. That fundamentally I believe that there is a movement right now that is working for democracy. And working for democracy not just in the let's increase voter turnout, but a very all-encompassing approach to democracy that extends to voting, to money in politics, to gerrymandering, but also to things like racial justice and other types of reforms, because people are really realizing now that you can't win on your own issue passion if you don't fix democracy. And one of the best examples of that is something called the Democracy Initiative. So in 2013, some of the biggest players in Washington, D.C., so Sierra Club, Communication Workers of America, NAACP, Greenpeace, Common Cause, all come together and say, we're just not making change. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new organization called Democracy Initiative that is explicitly going to fight and work to rethinking democracy, to really link issues to democracy, and then we're all going to devote part of our own internal resources to democracy as well. And this is going to be a public pledge almost, that we will fight for our own issues, but we'll also fight for democracy. And now that organization has 60 people a part of it that represent 30 million members. But you wouldn't hear about this, and one of the questions, I forget who said it about media, why aren't they covering this? That's a great question. I don't know why that wasn't covered, because I think that's an amazing step. And the woman who's running it is this amazing African-American woman who cut her teeth in the labor movement. So she gets that how these issues connect, how labor connects to environment, and how it connects to state-based issues that connect to democracy. And I'm always amazed talking with her because she just gets it in a way that I can only wish to one day begin to understand. And it's same change because the 14 out of 17 ballot initiatives, that's not possible without Democracy Initiative. Or with the other, we give, I think, 4 examples of what we call the democracy movement and its movement of movement approach. The point is that it's a bunch of movements. It's the environmental movement, the food movement, racial justice movement, they coalescing for democracy. It is a movement of movements fighting for democracy reform. And that's really wonderful. And it gives me a lot of hope talking to these people because they're seeing success. It's not just kind of they're doing the groundwork. Because the groundwork has already been laid in a lot of ways. Like I said, people are already upset. So they're really pushing democracy to go to new places. Because I think, one of the key things that I think those fighting for democracy have to grapple with, and they have in the past, but they have to increasingly deal with it, is that our democracy wasn't based on full inclusion. It was built on genocide and slavery, and in our Constitution was the 3/5 provision. African Americans weren't considered full people. They were used as tools for more representation for rural states, and that's something that we have to grapple with of what institutional legacies of our past are still embedded in our Constitution. And that makes everything much more complicated. But the important part is people are having those conversations, which is new. It's new, and one of the key questions that I think is still out there for this kind of relatively nascent. I mean, it's a nascent movement compared to the 40+ years of assault on our democracy, what we call the anti-democracy movement. The democracy movement is still totally in its nascent stage. So there's a lot of development to do, and one of them has to do with how do you bridge racial justice and democracy? How do you do that work? How do you include people of color in leadership when a lot of people of color can't go out in the streets without fear of being brutalized or, God forbid, killed? And that's we briefly try and start that conversation in the book because I don't proclaim to have the answers to that, but I think a lot of it comes with showing up and making sure that it's not about just focusing on democracy, but it's about also focusing and centering racial justice as well. Because again, our democracy was explicitly not inclusive of people of color. But all that is to say is that this movement that we try and describe that really no one has written about in a book, no one has really tried to talk about it. People in the movement do. They know that there's something happening, but there's been this profound lack of interest in covering it. And so our book was an attempt, and it was the last story I guess I'll tell is that after we finished the book, I hadn't slept in about 36 hours. And Frankie and I, so Frances, we call her Frankie, so, I said to her, you know what, Frankie, if there's one thing this book does, it's to enter the democracy movement into the political lexicon. To make this to give name to something that is already in existence. The work we did was just compile stories. That's easy. The hard work is the people out there on the streets and doing the behind the scenes work that has yielded this tremendous moment of grassroots optimism, I think. Although I think optimism is a bad word, and I'll end on this. We proclaim not to be optimists. We proclaim to be possibilists. We don't need to be certain of anything. We just have to know that it's possible. And I think that's what guides me and Frankie and a lot of people in the movement that, I almost hate to end on this, but there is a great statement by Chris Hedges, who I don't always agree with him, but he says, we don't fight fascism because we will win. We fight fascism because it's fascism. And in the same vein, we don't fight anti-democratic policies because we win, but we fight them because, damn it, they're anti-democratic, and we want a real democracy. And I'll end on, the democracy is basic human dignity. And that's why we fight for it, because every American should be heard. So yeah, I think that let's open the conversation. I probably didn't answer any of the questions that were asked of me. So I failed on that front, but I hope that provides some context through which we should now have a discussion.
So I had a question directly to sort of off of your conclusion. All of the instances of organizing, which I agree, I think are very inspiring.
Yeah.
I can see how they function to transform state and local politics.
Yeah.
And even possibly the Senate and the House. But with the Electoral College, what impact do these things that you bring up have with regard to a national election?
So one of the efforts that we talk about in the book is actually national popular vote. There is actually a way to get rid of the Electoral College without getting around it.
I'm all for it.
So basically, it's an interstate compact. So what you do is you states who pass the law agree that when the equivalent of 270 electoral votes, the states that equal 270 votes agree to it, then they will allocate their electoral votes based on whoever wins the popular vote. And that would effectively get rid of the Electoral College. They're 60% of the way there.
Yeah.
The Electoral College is atrocious. We're the only state that has it, or the only country that has it, and it should be abolished. In regards to national politics, I'm a little more pessimistic about that. In the sense that I don't think that anything is going to change or has any possibility of changing on national politics for the next 2 to 4 years. And we shouldn't be proclaiming that there is. I think that would be a waste of our resources and effort. Now, activism targeted at what's happening on a national level, that should continue because it's already been proven to work.
Yeah.
The repeal of the
Healthcare,
ACA
yeah.
is an example of how powerful grassroots organizing can be in resisting the agenda of this far right government that we currently have. So in terms of actually like passing public financing on a national level, no chance. I don't want to devote my resources to that right now. But by doing state-based stuff, we're going to start developing constituencies and grassroots communities that once we do change the composition of the federal government, we're going to be in a much better place to push for it, than we were. I mean, one of the most shocking things is like when it comes to gerrymandering, the Democrats could have just solved it. They could have disarmed the entire gerrymandering thing that had been, for 200 years. They could have passed a law that basically, they just could have figured out a way to deal with it. An independent redistricting body. I actually don't know exactly how it would work, like whether or not state law would supersede federal law, but basically they could have made it an issue at least when they control the states. But in 2008, they could have done something. They could have passed public finance. They could have dealt with these process issues, but the Democrats weren't interested in process issues. They dealt with healthcare instead, and I'm not going to deny that healthcare was a big deal, but they did have filibuster-proof majority in the Senate and supermajority in the House and the president. They could have dealt with process. But unlike the kind of this anti-democracy movement that realized that the process is actually the most important part of our government, they refuse to believe that. But I fault, it's no one's fault, I guess. We're all complicit. I don't know whose fault it is. But there was no grassroots constituency to push it. Had the Democrats been pushed on it when they had a supermajority in all branches of government, maybe we would have national public financing. So I guess the question is the reason I focus on the states is because I think that's setting the groundwork for if, hopefully, we have change in government and Trump isn't president for 30 years. It's a joke, please. That's setting the groundwork to do that work. Because I don't think we make any change on the federal level until we have a really broad movement to fix process, which isn't easy, but I think it's more often, more possible than ever before. Really, I do. I'm not just saying that.
All right.
How about information systems and people's desire to get their information from sources that agree with them?
Oh yeah, that's such a problem.
And the manipulation of those information systems.
Yeah. Now, one of the scariest things for me is, there are two things. One is kind of the kind of the development of social media and the kind of the decline of public radio and other public sources that kind of had a range of views, that people are just kind of the trend has been towards self isolation in terms of media outlets. And it's not just oh, look at these right-wingers reading Breitbart. It's left-wingers reading, I don't know. I guess only Mother Jones or something, although I think that the difference, comparing Breitbart and Mother Jones is just silly. Because Mother Jones is a real news outlet. But more like reading Occupy Democrats, if you know what that is. You know what I mean? Just reading that, right? Which isn't even a news source. So I guess it's as much of a news source as Breitbart is, because Breitbart really isn't a news source. But yeah, so there's the trend that way that people only are reading their own things, and the research shows this, and it's really scary. That the way in which the click rates are basically just bubbles, and then that's made so much worse by attempts to manipulate that through metadata, and it's frightening. One of the firms that the Trump-Bannon world hired this firm and really developed this firm called Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah.
And it's ambiguous what they actually did, but what they proclaim to do is have data points, 1,000 data points on every voter, and then be able to micro-target based on their deepest fears. And then we're getting to weird dystopian stuff. Now, I doubt they did that, but the fact that the potential is there with the kind of self-reinforcing news stuff and kind of no ability to fact-check within that community is frightening to me. I think the solution to that is public airwaves. And I know that's not enough, but something like net neutrality I think is very important, and kind of basic fundamental protections of internet, but also funding and supporting community radio and other outlets. And that's not going to save us from this, but I was just on a public radio station recently, and I was just so impressed with what they were talking about. And I don't know how to route people from only getting their news from I'm not going to talk about Breitbart folks, because I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with the segment of the population that is increasingly going to just be isolated. Because that's what's happening, that there are certain parts of people that they're just going to be isolated. Their only source of information is going to come from these outlets that are essentially information flow from the president. To think that Breitbart is anything but kind of a propaganda arm of the Trump presidency is.
Well, which is it? Their propaganda for him?
Well, one way it's routing one way. I don't know which way the flow is, but regardless, it's. So I don't know what to do with that right now.
I think there's also
next week is fine.
Next week is fine. Just very, very quickly, but I think that one of the core things that we have to think about as, I think I can say kind of progressive, or center to progressive thinkers is how do you reach the people who theoretically should be hearing more voices? How do we kind of, one thing I did recently, and I'm not trying to say this is the solution, but I saw one of these news outlets on social media that has 100,000 followers, something like that, proclaim something. And I was this is just not true. And so I emailed the guy, and I went back and forth 6 times with him this is false. And he said, no, it's not. And I wrote this full email to him about why this is false and why he's, why when you engaging in miscommunication even on the left, I mean, it's a huge problem. And eventually he conceded it. And he was like, oh, I'm so sorry, but it took me to say, like, oh yeah, I'm an expert in this field, like, don't tell me what to do. Like, I was like, don't tell me otherwise, like, I know my stuff. And he's like, oh, okay. But like, some sort of policing on the left is incredibly important right now, because, I mean...
Well, what do you then think, labor unions, right?
Yeah.
But they're gone. I mean, Reagan also took care of labor unions for the most
Yeah.
part. Do you think there's a future for labor unions
Yeah.
as disseminators of information for people?
Yeah.
I mean,
any sort of community group is a disseminator of
but
information.
do you think there is a future for labor in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I think democracy and labor go hand in hand, just like democracy and public education go hand in hand. As we reconceive of what democracy is, we reconceive of what our priorities are. And I think it's not a surprise that labor unions are part of this effort for democracy reform. I was marching with these folks in Pennsylvania for a gift ban. Pennsylvania doesn't have a gift ban. You can pay off the tuition for a state legislator, and that's just considered a gift and it's totally legal. The Teamsters march with us. And you see that over and over again. But I mean, yes, the fight for labor is a whole other fight, but you certainly are not going to get labor unions back if you don't fix democracy. I don't see that as possible, because I mean, you see the way in which money routes to states, big money routes to state politics that then pass right to work legislation. I mean, it's clear causal. It's a causal flow between the money in politics to right to work laws to decimation of labor unions. And getting rid of the labor unions is part of the assault on our democratic institutions, because labor, as you said, was a mode of disseminating information, but also a mode of resistance, of turning out people who are most affected by the economic policies, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's not an easy fight. None of this is easy, but I think that beginning to reconceptualize the role of labor is important. But yeah, the labor, I don't know how, but I know that if you do get money out of politics, it becomes much easier.
No, I was just hearing a few weeks ago about, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but some politician, I believe, calling for the same kind of transparency of sources that is expected of mainstream news outlets in social media, which social media wasn't designed for news initially, but of course now it's news.
Yeah.
And so I think that was one of the, Facebook is being called in front of Congress because of this, Cambridge Analytics stuff that went on during the election. And there was, I've heard some legislators calling for, having the same kinds of transparency regulations on social media that are on the news outlets. And so the question is that just dead in the water, or is something like that possible?
Yeah, it's always possible. Yeah, I mean, there should absolutely be transparency and regulations on who can buy ads on social media.
Exactly.
I mean, most people don't probably realize that actually Russians buying ads on Facebook is legal, as long as they're issue ads. As long as they're not directly, I'd have to 100% fact check. I forget it. There's always these small distinctions in money and politics and campaign finance, but as long as it was an issue ad not advocating directly for a candidate, I believe that's 100% legal. And that's based on an FEC regulation. And the FEC could probably make that illegal. But the FEC is functionally useless. In fact, the former chair of the Federal Elections Commission, Ann Ravel, called the FEC as dysfunctional, or they call it dysfunctional, and then as useless as the male nipple. That was the FEC commissioner who said that the commission, as she was leading the commission, said, this commission is functionally useless. It serves no purpose. And then she resigned in a New York Times op-ed and said, this is a waste of my time. She's great. She's fantastic. She's one of the gutsiest people I've ever met. But the FEC could do it, but the way the FEC is composed, it's composed of people of 3 of each party. And
They're deadlocked.
it's deadlocked, and nothing gets done. And then, Russians can buy ads, and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
As many people know, Cambridge Analytica is controlled or financed by the Mercer family.
Yep.
Yeah.
We only learned that they control and fund Breitbart when Breitbart applied for press credentials and through the White House and actually needed to disclose their ownership and so on. Is there any reason to be optimistic about any improvements in transparency, or are there groups that are working on improvements in transparency
Yeah.
for these types of, whether it's ownership or control of these types of media organizations?
Yeah, and I think that first and foremost, journalists. I mean, as much as like print journalism and like journalism, like, has transitioned to online outlets and stuff like that. I mean, there are good journalists working on this, and most of this stuff has been broken by journalists who either are given information off the record or whatever. But there are other organizations doing this as well, like what's called ProPublica has been releasing a lot of stuff about like campaign finance and stuff like that. What is it? It's not the Campaign Legal Center. It's another organization, CREW. I forget exactly what it stands for. Citizens for Ethics Reform has filed for and they won the lawsuit to get the visitor logs from Mar-a-Lago. And that's
There are none.
which theoretically, apparently there are none. There are groups working on transparency, but transparency is really difficult. It's really difficult. It's very easy to operate in secrecy. And I think you're right that a lot of effort needs to be put towards transparency of the administration, because nothing. Humans act the worst when they think no one is looking. And as another person said, Louis Brandeis, I think he's actually misquoted as saying this, but take it anyway, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I'm totally in favor of all transparency of this administration. But yeah, people are working on it. There's really good work being done, but it's hard, especially when you're routing money and stuff like that through 501c4s, and then route to another 501c4 that then routes to a super PAC, that then routes to some business. It gets very complicated very quickly, and you begin to look like a conspiracy theorist with all the different little push pins and the different funneling of money. But there are people doing that work. I can't do that work, but there are people doing that work, certainly. Yeah.
You had said earlier that we shouldn't expect to see too much of a change on the national scale in the next 4 years.
I said potentially two.
Potentially two. I was curious if there's a connection between the democracy movement and the Democratic Party.
That's a great question.
So there seems to be a laser focus within the Republican Party that the Democrats just don't have, and maybe in 2009 we did, but now I feel like there's this. I mean, Bernie bros are a perfect example. People not voting for Hillary because they thought that.
Yeah.
Whatever. So I'm curious if there's a connection between the actual process and that particular party that seems to.
I mean, the Democratic Party is a great example of something that really should be at the front of this, but aren't. On one hand, it's because the Democrats are not equally funded by big money, but certainly have a lot of money as well. So there's that tension. But I just think that there's been a real lack. I mean, recently there's been much more urgency in this, but about pushing the Democratic Party. And one great example, I think, that shocks most people is that Lyndon Johnson voted against every single Civil Rights Act until 1957 when he was voted into the Senate. And then he ended up signing two of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation of all time. And what he said was, make me do it. And FDR said the same thing when it came to labor. Make me do it. I think the same principle applies now. That the Democrats have acted really, really badly on these issues for decades now. They've not served as any sort. They've enabled the takeover of by big money and the assault on the democratic process. They haven't put any resistance. So oftentimes when people ask me, well, what should we do with the Democratic Party? You have to make them do it. And I don't know exactly how, but I will say that there were a lot of activists who were pushing for the Democratic Party platform to include really strong democracy reform as part of it, and they won. The problem is that people kind of stopped that effort. I mean, they didn't stop, but there wasn't enough critical mass to make Hillary talk about those issues during the campaign. I mean, we had people. In fact, one of I worked with this organization called Democracy Matters, and one of our students went up to Hillary in the primary and said, "Do you support public financing of elections?" And she had to go on record on it. Following these politicians around and asking them about democracy is a great idea. And another great idea is when you get a fundraising request by a phone call or a little envelope asking for it, send the envelope back with the "not until you address big money in politics." They see that. I know it sounds really stupid, but that's something that a lot of people have been doing recently. And it's a great way, when you take away the fundraising potential among grassroots donors, there is potential for change. And also, not everyone is going to do this, but getting arrested is a great idea too. I mean, I don't want to advocate that in and of itself, but
Say that one again?
getting arrested, sitting in and stuff like that is a great way to make your voice heard. The Democracy Spring March that was referenced, we got 1,300 people arrested for these issues.
Were you?
I was not arrested. I wanted to be, but I wasn't quite allowed to be. I kind of was, but I was doing other work, making sure we got media coverage, which we didn't anyway. So next time I'll get arrested.
How can democracy work when we have such low turnout for which is beyond the voter suppression issues?
Yeah.
And also, how does democracy work when people don't vote with their self-interests?
Yeah, those are good questions. I think that there are very easy ways to increase turnout. Maybe not, I guess intellectually easy. To get them passed and then to kind of put them in practice might be a little harder. But making our registration process more easy is a great way to start. We're one of the worst countries when it comes to voter registration. If we were to, for example, there's no real legs on this yet, but if we were to, let me not do that. Automatic voter registration, like I was saying, if we had every single state pass AVR, I think the number of people registered would increase greatly. And then you see significant turnout increase. In Oregon, about 270,000 people were registered under AVR, and 97,000 voted. That's new voters, 97,000 new voters.
Well, they also have different ways of voting, right?
Right, well, they also have mail-in ballots, which I think is another way to increase voting as well. Mail-in ballots are a great way to increase voter turnout. Vote centers. So instead of voting at precincts, having one big vote center where people can drop off their ballot. That's another great way. But the registration I want to kind of harp on for a second, because if you look at the way registrations are by quintile of Americans in terms of wealth, the top level of wealth register at around 85%, 80 to 85%, and then it decreases basically it could not be more linear. And so the poorer you are, the less likely you are to vote, which isn't surprising. Which is why expanding automatic registration to welfare offices and other kind of government agencies would greatly increase or decrease that gap and increase the voter turnout. Because there are people who want to vote, they don't, it's just not on the top of their agenda. And then when election day comes around and they're not registered, they can't vote anyway. Registrations were originally designed to keep immigrants from voting. That's the story that most people don't realize. North Dakota doesn't even have voter registration. It's the one state that doesn't. I'm not saying abolish voter registration, because I think I think there is probably a good reason to have some sort of registration among voters, but knowing that history is really important. Voter registration was a way of keeping immigrants from voting in the big cities. It used to just be cities too. It used to be you register to vote in the cities, but in the rural counties you don't have to. And that's changed. But we have to deal with that now. And I think making the registration process easier is a great way to start with that question. And voting in self-interest, that's really difficult. But what I will say is that I think we can't have civic life unless we have civic education. My goodness, it's not, we have no actual civic education. Honestly, I don't even know my state rep. Well, actually I do in Massachusetts. I don't know my local government. And I Frankie doesn't either. I'm not trying to throw Frankie on the bus, but the point is that we don't actually have any sort of culture around learning about these things. We barely have forums to discuss these things, but there are a lot of external politics that can be done around those issues across the country. Now that's harder in terms of legislation, but there's a lot of room to be done. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what civic education or civic enrichment could do to the question of self-interest, voting against self-interest, but also raising participation rates. And of course, there's always the idea of mandatory voting, which I don't necessarily agree with. I don't actually have a real position on that. But I could give you 12 policies that could raise that rate. And I think that's a start. You're never going to get to 100, but other countries do much better, so it's not like anti-human to expect better.
How are you going to, excuse me, how are you going to get your message to the next generation of activists? It seems like you need to almost recruit younger people, or at least get your message out, your democracy movement out and known through high schools and bank streets and public education and of course colleges.
Yeah, I mean, yes.
How do you do it?
How do you do it? That's a great question. Someone can grant me $100 million and I'll disseminate it to every
Wish
person.
is my command.
Great. Getting young people involved, I think, is really difficult, and I'll give kind of two. I don't know if this is the answer you're trying to elicit, but I think that people, especially in the baby boomer generation, have largely been asking me about why aren't young people involved in politics, and I think that we need to start with empathy for people in our generation. If you really think about kind of what we've gone through and all we've ever known, it's pretty bleak. And for a lot of people, especially the folks who I was talking with in Bank Street right now, I mean, there's one young woman of color who basically confronted me saying, what's the point? Because in her lifetime, things have only gotten worse. And in my lifetime too, but really in her lifetime, all she's ever seen is real kind of, problems. And I think just starting from a place of empathy is a great point for when people ask the question of like, why aren't young people involved? Especially with like the existential threat of climate change always on our minds, and student debt and the sort. But the second thing is, and I don't really know if this gets to your question at all, but is mentoring. You don't really learn to engage in politics and engage with these issues unless someone mentors you. I was mentored. I had an organizer who dropped out of Vassar in 1963 or 64 to go join the Freedom Rides. And then she created this organization, Democracy Matters, and then mentored me when I was in college. You don't just learn to engage politically. You have to be taught. And so one of the things that I've been, especially when there's no civic education. Bank Street's a different story. I mean, Bank Street teaches civic education. It teaches critical thinking. It teaches about institutions. But most people don't have that. And even someone like me, I went through Bank Street. But even I wasn't ready to engage politically until I was taught. I had the best foundation possible. But I couldn't just jump in and do organizing myself. And that's like saying jumping in to be a CEO of a corporation that you have no experience running, right? I mean, it's not quite the same, but you get my point. And so I've been very recently motivated by the idea of mentoring young people, especially those who have experience doing work in the past and have I think that's a really good first step. And encouraging young people to read books, I think, is also great. I've often been telling people to recommend a book to a friend, especially if they're young. A lot of people have been buying this book, which is nice for the young people in their lives. And that's been really encouraging to me. And getting into high schools as well. I don't think many high schools would be willing to touch this kind of political book. I just think the culture around making sure that you're not getting, attacked on being ideological is really real. But there is some interest. But I think making sure that we reinvigorate civic culture and civic education.
Are there in high schools, it's been a long time since I was in high school, but I remember that there were groups who focused on social justice or political organizing. Of course, there was anti-war. Is that being targeted at all in the democracy movement, trying to get to these high school groups?
No. Foundation
maybe of similar mind.
No, foundations don't fund that kind of work. There's a whole system of how you get funded. You don't get funded for doing movement work. You don't get funded to organize young people. That's just not how things are funded anymore.
I want to acknowledge time and also thank Adam for his marathon day at Bank Street, starting at 8 a.m. and going until 8:10 p.m.